So now you've heard it. You've heard it from me a couple of seconds ago. Companies closing their doors in South Africa, laying off staff, short time as well. People bringing, less money home. You even have the Reserve Bank saying, sorry, we have to lower the rate. Economy's not growing. Things are, we can bring out the pom-poms and try and sing up Cyril, but he's not doing enough. And we need to see more guidance. We need to see more policy certainty. We're seeing flipping and flopping and no backbone, and something needs to happen in this country before we get a downgrade. Simple as that. But we can talk about the macro stuff. We also look at the micro, and especially very, very micro as it pertains to yourself and your children. Can you future-proof yourself, especially when it comes to these type of job losses? So Dr. Mostert is the director for the Institute of Futures Research at Stellenbosch University. And, hey, people love you, hey? Welcome back.
I love you too.
There we go. There we go. Now, can one really future-proof oneself? A lot of people saying nobody's indispensable, surely.
Yes, I think the correct answer is probably that you can't.
Yeah.
Only because the future's not ever entirely predictable. But it is a game of probability rather than of having a kind of determined future. And there are things that I think you can think about, and it starts with where you think your future will come from and who will give it to you.
Yeah.
And typically, if you think it will come from something called government or big business, that will give you one approach. If you think you're the maker of your future, that will be entirely different.
Which is entrepreneurship, as that overly used phrase. But it's important. I was reading a bit. I don't know if you saw it on it was Netwerk 24. Michael Jordan wrote a little piece on the matric results.
Yes.
And he raised concern about the math mark, obviously, for reasons. He did say from a tech perspective, yes, mathematics will help you analyze a lot of these new technologies and gives you the capability of dealing with these new technologies. But not solely. He did also say that young people should get online and do those courses, whether we're talking LinkedIn Learning, whether we're talking Udemy, whether we're talking the courses that you offer, for example, at Stellenbosch University or UCT or UWC, but you have to go and future-proof yourself by doing that. So where does one really start?
Yes, I think the wise thing, is just forget all the others, just 2 hours, and that's the way to go. No.
Send him the bill, Bruce. They've got more than enough money, says Vim. So, absolutely.
I think the reality is there's so much for free out there.
Yes.
Prior to the internet, knowledge was really the preserve of the privileged.
Yes.
And now we all have access to it. Part of the difficulty is there's an almost overwhelming volume of it. But more and more we're seeing a kind of consolidation in the market of online providers of learning. And if you're a discerning reader of the internet, which will certainly be one of the future skills, by the way, just between brackets, you'll have to develop some sort of competence around being a digital dietitian. Think about your digital diet, and that includes your knowledge diet. But more and more, if you're a little bit discerning, you're willing to spend a little bit of time, maybe have a look at page 2 of Google. That's apparently where Osama bin Laden's been hiding. You'll find some astonishing, extremely high-quality education. Of course, accreditation is still an important dimension, but certainly knowledge is something that when you have internet access, you can't complain.
One doesn't. You don't knock universities.
Of course not.
Because they have an important role to play. Some of them are slower than others when it comes to playing catch-up, right? Because life cycles, certain courses get a lot shorter, and you need to catch your wake up, and you need to. But you at the Future Studies department, so you don't have that problem. And I look at this, and I think to myself, why don't people see this? And I answered that question to myself as well, and I said, people see their current realities, and that is what they're absorbed with. You're sitting behind a mic, and you think that is who you are, and this is what makes you. You don't necessarily think about what your future self, to your initial point, what your future self could be.
Yes.
And so we get tied up in all the negativity on the now and the economy, etc. And that's the one big inhibitor.
Yes.
And then we bring that home as parents, and we only focus on the current education system as it exists.
Yes.
And look at the problems, and oh my word, we're going to hell in a handbasket again.
Yes, and the difficulty is you might be right. And the difference with entrepreneurs is that they're always looking for the opportunity, and that's really the distinction. It's not about a Pollyanna naive optimism. That really doesn't help anybody. It is about being discerning. You know, there's some fascinating research that suggests that foreigners are more innovative than locals. That's not unique to South Africa.
Yeah.
That's an international trend. There was a technology contest, for example, in the United States a number of years ago. 4 of the 5 finalists were South Africans. Of course, we'd like to say that's an inherently South African evidence of it's in our DNA. But of course, but it has an awful lot to do with when you step over a border, when you step over a boundary. You notice things that in Buddhism is called, you have a beginner's mind. You look at the world as if it is the first time that you see it. And that's often why people who come to countries like South Africa, they have a beginner's mind. In other words, they can see things that the kind of lag fatigue that we have with the general reading of society has blinded us to. It's important to understand that the headlines are not the trend lines. The headlines are not the trend lines, and certainly they don't describe where the gaps are. And so entrepreneurs have a view of reading the environment to identify some of those. And again, that is a team sport.
Yes.
Of course, we like the idea of the sole entrepreneur with a bright idea, 3 o'clock in the morning, that takes over the universe. The reality is that forming communities that scan the environment increases the likelihood of finding those opportunities. Of course, also gives you partnerships in business, and gives you new collective thinking.
Now, Paul Rafali from Nomu would be listening to this and rolling his eyes, not because of what you said, because of what we're saying about entrepreneurship. And to a degree, he's right. Not everybody's going to become an entrepreneur. Sure. You get the so-called radical 1% that'll create most of the jobs, maybe radical 2% that creates, or 3%, whatever that might be. Be that as it may, you still need people in businesses that are entrepreneurially minded.
Yes, we refer to it as intrapreneurship.
Yes.
Some work done by Pinchot on the subject.
Yes.
And in fact, many businesses now require of their staff to have an intrapreneurial flair. In other words, to scan the internal business environment, link it with opportunities in the external environment, and create proposals, new opportunities for that business that some business are allowing their own staff to benefit from. So certainly we're seeing this as a rising skill. And so that's why, just again, South Africa to some degree is quite traditional. You know, we have an enormous psychological dependency on the government. Our psychological contract with business is, I would say, almost dysfunctionally dependent.
Yes.
And the idea that you can somehow save yourself in South Africa is not a very well-developed idea, as indeed it is not across many parts of Africa, but it's changing.
But heaven forbid you fail. Everybody, they pounce on you like a bunch of vouchers and they pick off the rest of what's left of your bones. And that is another challenge that we have.
I think that's right. And I think entrepreneurs are a great deal more comfortable with the idea of failing. Of course, failing is never the intention. But the idea of failing fast and failing forward, as we often call it, and then learning enormous amounts from that is an enormous investment, in fact, in your career. Now, of course, I understand that some are more vulnerable than others, and such volatility cannot be endured by everyone's pocket. But the idea that you might fail is partially the other side of the coin of why you might succeed. And I think we have quite a low risk tolerance, generally speaking, among South Africans. The school system certainly doesn't encourage it.
True.
And but I do think there is a shift. There is an early dawn of people going, wait a second, all these expectations I had of government and big business, I don't think that's necessarily well founded. That's not to say big business can't play an enormous role. They should, and they do. And I think they're an incredibly important part of the South African economy. But the mindset is important.
True. And one looks at the airports company, which is a state-owned entity, but anyway, they're doing phenomenal stuff with False Bay College.
Yes.
They getting people to build their own homes around the airport, but that's a leadership thing, right?
That's such a great example, and it's exactly the kind of partnerships that I've been referring to. We call it making new systemic connections, looking at the ecosystem around you, and then finding new opportunities for connecting things that you wouldn't traditionally have connected. And that's a great example.
Even a market at the airport where people can cook and they can come and put a brilliant little spread together, and on a Saturday and a Sunday, communities can make their way to the airport with parking free. And you can maybe have an afternoon out. By the way, if you've just tuned in, Mornay is the director of the Institute for Futures Research at Stellenbosch University, and just having a good chat about the future of work in the light of the job cuts that we have. And it's an uncertain world that we live in. So you can either succumb to the chaos around you, or you can try and find your potential place within the chaos, understanding, how things are changing, and then work your way to it. But it's easier said than done, Mornay. Some would argue that, well, you need money, and to be able to do that sort of thing, but that's not necessarily true.
I'm not sure that it is necessarily true.
Yeah.
And in fact, there's an old truism in entrepreneurship, which is the first thing to understand is never use your own money. So I think that we've already established now that access to knowledge doesn't take all that much money. Okay, you need internet access. That's true.
Yeah, and we spoke about this the last time. It should be a human right,
right.
And it is. Yeah.
So let's assume that you have internet access and you don't have an awful lot of money. The next thing I would suggest is let's have a look at your network. Whom do you know, and whom do they know? We call it a systemic map of your potential influence.
Yes.
The next thing is that if everybody has access to that world of knowledge, what's your take on it? And now we need some creativity. This is where you hear Michael Jordan talking about critical thinking and creative thinking and innovation and so on. What's your take on it?
Yeah.
Take a view. Now that you have a view, how do you influence that systemic network?
Yes.
That your view is one of the options, certainly that is available in the future. And that's really an important step. That's why future thinking becomes really important, because you spoke about future-proofing yourself. I think lots of people are working on past-proofing themselves.
Yes.
Yeah? Should the past happen again, I'll be prepared. Well, that's one of the least likely things to occur. And people love this idea of going back to basics and so on. But of course, the reality is that the basics are the one thing that have proven themselves not to survive. Why would that be the thing that you want to go back to?
Yep.
So I think develop some knowledge, scan the environment, build a network, develop a sense, build an idea. And when I say build an idea, I don't mean make a suggestion. We see a lot of these people in corporates say, 4 years ago, I made a suggestion in a meeting. People weren't very excited about it, and now they're retrenching. Well,
got up off your arse and you did something about it in the first place.
That would help too. So I think the ability to develop a business case for a future opportunity, and by the way, that is tautology, all opportunities are in the future. That's the only possible place where an opportunity can exist, and therefore the future is not a bad thing to study.
Michael also said something. He said, listen, the degree I studied helped me, it served me well, but I've dedicated myself to future learning.
Yes.
And let's talk about people who might not have a hell of a lot of bucks.
Sure.
So you become a waiter, you become a waitress, and maybe you don't work for a good restaurant, maybe they don't give you a basic salary and you get tips. You can go to, I was pointing this out earlier, Udemy, right? And let's say, and I'll just do an exercise here. Let's say you heard that, Python is, and it's not the snake, Python is a good thing to learn. And, Python and machine learning, what the heck is that? And you type that in, and you then wait. And you wait. Now, remember, you've probably made $4,000, $5,000, 6, maybe 10 if you're lucky. And you find a course, and it's called Python Data Science and Machine Learning Bootcamp. 179 Rand 99. You then click on it, and you go through, and there's 22 hours, 22 minutes of on-demand video.
Education is now undervalued.
Yep.
There is, if you were a market investor, and you could acquire this, you would spend all your money on it. It's completely undervalued. If you think about how much time and energy the developer of that program had to invest in producing that, for which you will pay $179 there. That's why I love the movies. They spend $150 million making this thing, which you can buy for $80. It's a hell of a bargain. So we are in a time now where knowledge has never been this undervalued. So you have to be a daily buyer and consumer of knowledge. It's cheaper than at any time in history. Of course, there's an overwhelming volume.
Yes, and you have to be discerning.
That means discernment. And we feel that, for example, that discernment will be one of those skills that people will learn explicitly in future. So Michael Jordan admits that he got something from his degree. That's good news. And one of the things I'd argue that he got from it is this idea of discernment, judgment, the ability to make sense of the madness around you. So we can very well see that, the future university is going to have discernment as a module, double in discernment. Tomorrow morning you have a double in curiosity followed by imagination. And these kinds of skills, they're sometimes called meta skills, skills about skills, skills that govern the other skills. These kind of meta skills, I think, are the kind of curriculum of at least one version of education in the future.
Exactly. And we had, who was it, Bruce? Was it Professor Robert Liu, founder of Harvard X, heavily involved in edX. And he said, you know what? Currently, courses or content sits within courses. We're actually going to liberate that whole thing. And eventually, you're going to say to yourself, this is what I want to achieve. And I said to him, can't you get AI eventually to help put a course together for you? Because you've got hundreds of millions of bits of data. You understand people's journeys through, training of the system. And then you say, oh, but I want to become a futurist, and I want to do so in Kazakhstan or whatever. And this AI, through their system, can then take a lot of that free content and put a journey together for you.
It's a wonderful opportunity.
Yeah.
And I think you should work on that. That's a fantastic idea and a great example of the university of the future.
We are joined by Dr. Morné Mostert, the director at the Institute for Futures Research at Stellenbosch University. And just to recap, we were talking about positioning oneself for the future. I think we realize that we live in constant chaos. And there are a couple of reasons for it. If you're in South Africa, it's because there's no policy certainty. It's because we're staring a downgrade in the face. And that is going to be detrimental because it's the only... People are still putting money in this country because there's one grouping, Moody's, that says they're still investment grade-ish. But when we don't, once we hit junk status with them, it's going to be harder for people wanting to put their money in South Africa to justify that, because a lot of the time it's other people's money they're putting there, and they've got to be able to justify it. And that leaves us in a bit of a quandary as the understatement for 2020. On the other side, we've got technological advancements. It affects the banks. You know what the banks are doing. Is it Standard Bank, Nedbank, ABSA? Going to be closing branches. People are going to be unemployed. And plus the other story. So what do? You go, crawl up in a fetal position and cry until you find another job, or you make your own future possible. How does one do that? Dr. Mostert was saying that education is so undervalued, and he means that in a positive sense, obviously, in the sense that you can get a 22-hour course for 179 Rand. But how's that possible? Well, at 179 Rand, if 2 million people buy it, that developer who might have spent 80,000 on it will be making a lot more money, but it's more affordable to you. So how does one get onto this particular journey? What are the first steps?
Well, I think the first thing is to, and this is an important part of our work, is to see what you can anticipate. Now, the reality is that we all become lulled into a sense of security. I've worked here for 3 or 4 years. Surely they love me, I love them, and this will last forever. Well, the evidence is against you. And so the first thing to do is to think about is, what are you doing with your so-called third shift? If your first shift is at work and your second shift is to sleep, What are you doing with your third shift? Are you watching that soapy again and again and again? I mean, how many times can the guy have a brother no one knew about? Or are you starting on a journey of learning that already preempts the risk that you may in fact be? Now compare these two candidates. Candidate A is secure in a job in a large organization or the government, arrives home, watches the soapy, braai on a Saturday, moan about the boss on a Sunday, back in the slog on Monday. Candidate B has the same job in the same company. Of course, the family is important when you get home. But then what? Look at what happens over a 3-year period. If candidate A watches the soapy for an hour and candidate B learns something from the internet. I don't mean post cat pictures. I mean learn something from this vastly underpriced world of almost free education on the internet. In 3 years' time, you see a very significant difference.
Unless you're posting the cat picture on Shutterstock, because it's such a beautiful picture that you've taken, and everybody wants to buy it.
If you're in the cat business or the photography business, this is a great idea.
Exactly. And then... So doing the learning is the one thing, and we've touched on this now. So doing the learning is the one thing. The rest of it is actually starting to create your reality.
Right.
So surely that centers around who you spend time with, where you spend time.
Critically. So let's imagine, again, we have candidate A and candidate B. So candidate A is the soapy guy. Candidate B says, okay, 1 hour a week, I'm going to meet with someone interesting.
Right.
Yeah. I'm going to expand not only my knowledge through this underpriced education, I'm going to extend my systemic map of influence. I'm going to meet someone. I'm going to take them for lunch, and I'm going to learn something from them.
Yes.
So now I'm not only building my knowledge, but I'm also building my network. So when it does go bad, or even before it does, I am what we call systemically integrated into my systemic ecosystem.
Yes.
And even in natural ecosystems, where systems are better interconnected, those systems have a longer life cycle and greater resilience. In other words, if it is challenged, the interconnections will save you, is essentially the lesson here.
Yeah, it's a bit, I don't know if I don't know you can even simplify that, but if I am doing a job or tell someone that I'm able to do a job for them, if I had to do that on my own, I don't have all the critical skills to do so. But with my network that I've built, I'm able to not just deliver what they want, but through the collective thinking and
That's
shared
exactly
value.
Right. Let me give you a practical example, because this may sound theoretical and academic to you. Here's a practical example. Crowdsourcing is exactly what this is.
Yep.
It's a way of using your ecosystem, the people in your ecosystem, to help you fund some of your business. Now, of course, it's difficult to persuade people, but therein lies part of the challenge of influence and persuasion, one of those future skills that certainly will not, I think, collapse. It will just strengthen. So when I said earlier, you now have to persuade this network that your idea is something that the future might like.
Right.
Crowdsourcing is a very practical example of that. And companies are using this idea not only to attract funding, but even in a recent methodology known as design thinking, that's essentially a crowdsourcing of design, a human-centric approach to design.
And
so
encourages failure as well.
Indeed
fast.
So. Rapid prototyping and rapid learning from prototyping mistakes. So the point I'm trying to make is that trying to hang on to a job and picketing when it goes bad is no longer a strategy for a long-term career.
Yeah. Well, they'll just put you under business rescue. And then, as SAA found, as a union, you can't say a darn thing. You have to go with what the law states. So I think that was quite a clever move from the president, by the way. And I don't know if that 2 billion was given to Eskom yet, and that 2 billion was owed by Treasury. This could be Tito's way of saying, yeah, I could close you tomorrow if I want to. Don't mess with me.
Yes, but show of force.
Show of force. But just a little bit more about your Futures Research Institute. We know you do a lot of work with corporates, but as a field of study, I think it's one of the things, and I'm doing this as a shameless punt because I think it's, you guys have delivered some wonderful people. Clem Sunter, for example, and a whole host of other people, including Dr. Rose Phillips, that joins us on a regular basis, have gone through your particular institute. So who should be doing that?
There are two ways in which you can get involved with us. The one is the academic journey, and the kind of target audience for that is... The way we normally say it is that, and this is a little bit of a jibe at my MBA colleagues, but the way we normally say it is that the MBAs want to advance in the world as it is, the futures guys want to change the world.
I like
that. Of course, that's a crazy oversimplification, but I think there is a first clue there that the kind of people that we tend to attract are people who are inherently dissatisfied with the status quo.
Yeah.
And that, as many thinkers have said, is the first thing towards changing something,
Exactly.
a great dissatisfaction. I think Mark Twain was the first to point that out. The kind of people we attract are typically experienced in their career. They're typically consultants, advisors, and they can be internal advisors, and they work in strategy units, innovation units, long-term planning units, long-term project type units. But they have management experience, and they typically have a degree, and sometimes 2 or 3. So it's typically an audience that has seen a few things, and they often use the program to kind of make sense of their own reading of the situation. And of course, these are people who are deeply curious about reinventing the future rather than perpetuating the past. That's a really important observation to make. But the other way to get involved with us is that that you can join us as an associate. And so that means that, and we've been doing this since 1974, that companies simply join and we share with them some of our thinking. They ask us for a view on a number of things. We share a number of reports. We do an environmental scan, and we help them to develop their own abilities for this competence of strategic foresight.
Wow. Because we talk about competitive strategy these days, and a lot of it still centers around the world as we know it.
Indeed.
A lot of it does. And a lot of it is also retrospective. Let's look at what they did back in the day. But damn it, we're not there.
Well, that's exactly right. You know, as I've often said, futurists may have many faults, but living in the past isn't one of them. We're interested in what hasn't happened yet, and therefore what can be created and designed.
Absolutely. Well, Dr. Mostert, thank you very much for joining us. That was a record chat, close to 40 minutes. Dr. Mostert, Director at the Institute for Futures Research at Stellenbosch University. And you can always check the podcast. People always, after this call, where can we get the podcast? Well, don't worry, it'll be online. Go to capetalk.co.za.